We are in this study of surrendering our lives over to Christ and trying to be better servants of His in some senses, and trying to improve our commitment and our relationship with the Savior. We're in this study that we've been working through. I want to look at the very end of Lesson 5. I'm going to get into Lesson 6 today and get it started as well. But I want to look at the very end of Lesson 5 because there was just one point at the end of that I just didn't get to Wednesday that I want to make sure we at least look at for a moment before we move into Lesson 6. And so, into Lesson 5, talking about Paul, and really, really these two lessons are side by side. They're connected, and talking about the things that Paul did. We talk about his challenge towards Peter there in Galatians. We talk about Paul talking about how he didn't feel like he had attained and accomplished everything yet, that he was still being perfected in some senses. And the one thought we didn't get to here at the end of the study was what changed in the life or mind of Paul that kind of sparked or was the catalyst to all this change in Paul's life. Say that one more time. Okay, so on the road to Damascus, who's he encounter? He encounters Jesus, right? And really, was Paul's situation a case of not knowing who Jesus was? No. Okay, so his was not an issue of ignorance in the sense that he didn't know anything about Jesus. What did Paul need to change? His attitude or what he thought about Jesus. Paul needed to change what he thought about Jesus. If you notice in the worksheets, in the lesson sheets, they say that what changed was this radical approach, this radically changed approach towards what Paul thought about Jesus. Before, what did he think about Jesus? Before that encounter. Okay, he was a blasphemer. But what did he think about that blasphemous, if you will, or that this standing against or opposed to Jesus? What did he think about that activity? That's right. He absolutely thought he was honoring God by doing so. His thought of Jesus prior to the road to Damascus, prior to getting into Damascus and in being taught by Ananias, prior to all that coming, Paul was completely and totally convinced in his mind and his conscience that what he was doing as it relates to Jesus was exactly what he should be doing in order to honor God. And yet, in the statement that's made to him by Jesus on that road, he said, "Why persecutest thou me? It is hard for you to what? To kick against the goads." So Jesus tells Paul, basically, Saul of Tarsus, maybe we should say, that you grasp and understand, really, that your mind needs to change about what you think of me. You've been kicking against the truth. You've been kicking against the realities. You have been resistant to the evidences and truths that have been presented to you as it relates to what you should think about Jesus. And maybe you ought to reconsider. And so that's what happens with Paul. He completely changes his viewpoint, if you will, of what he thinks about Jesus. Is it possible for us to need a radical change in the way we think about Jesus? Sure, right? It would be dishonest of us to say Saul of Tarsus needed it, but I would never need that. Saul of Tarsus was a bad guy at that point in time, and he really needed to rechange what he thought about Jesus, but that would never happen to me. The truth is, all of us may at times, when we're learning more, we're grasping better knowledge, we're gaining better appreciation, there may be times where we have to rethink, if you will, or change the way we think about Jesus. And a willingness to do that will have a tremendous effect upon whether or not we can honor God through the Savior or not. And my willingness to make those changes, even when they may be very, very radical, as it was for Saul of Tarsus, in order to do that. And before Paul could ever become zealous to preach the gospel, before Paul could ever take that message to the Gentiles, before he could ever accomplish any of the work, he first had to convert and change the way he thought about the Savior. Thoughts or questions about that? I just didn't get to that aspect Wednesday night before we closed. And you see all of that unfold, and even what Paul says, you see the history of it unfolding in Acts chapter 9. You hear him reiterate what occurred there in Acts chapter 26, and you begin to witness the real change that occurs. Okay. Yeah. 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 I think in fairness, we need to acknowledge the fact that there are people who, for lack of a better word, within their own level of honesty in the moment, really believe what they believe about Jesus. They're not trying to be deceptive or dishonest. I don't think Saul was trying to be dishonest. He was trying to honor what his conscience was telling him. Jesus just finally encounters him and says, listen, you need to rethink about what your conscience is really telling you here and make this change. And I think in fairness, we need to recognize we're going to run into some people that are the same way. They may be wrong, but there can still be a level of sincerity and honesty, if you will, about that. And what they need is conversion. What they need is to rethink those things. Go ahead, Jim.
When Paul heard the truth, he changed immediately. He didn't linger on a thing. He did it right now.
Yeah. Saul, why tarriest thou? And so he what are you waiting for? It's like that time of waiting is over. It was time to take care of that. And go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry. Sure. And you could see some. I mean, we could, without really knowing in some senses, but you can at least understand, though whether we know whether that was the real motive or not, we can understand how a message coming from a man who had a completely radical conversion would be a good voice to go out and teach people who needed radical conversions in their lives, the people that were really going to have to make drastic changes in order to be followers of Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, and that zeal and a willingness in some senses to go talk to the Gentiles. You go back to the first text that we dealt with in this lesson, where Paul goes and encounters Peter, because Peter, so long as the Jews weren't around, the circumcision weren't around, he'd sit at table with Gentiles. But as soon as the Jews come around, he wouldn't, and Paul had to deal with that. You think about that. If anybody should have understood in some senses that the gospel was for the Gentile world as well, who should it have been? Peter, right? Because he's the one that God comes and gives him a complete vision, a miraculous vision, in order for him to get the point that the Gentile world has been embraced into, and yet he's still struggling with it by the time that Paul encounters him here. And so, God chooses a man maybe with a willingness, zeal, and a willingness to take this message into a Gentile world where there might have been some reluctance and some challenges that some of the others might have experienced. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Guess we'll never know. Right. And certainly so. God's ability to understand and see those circumstances and know exactly who he needs. for certain purposes.
Well, I've understood. The Gentiles seemed to me, they were looking for something, but they didn't know what they were looking for.
Yeah.
So it was explained to them.
Yeah. And this radical change, I mean, really, there were, and the writer talks about this a little bit, probably a little bit in both lessons in some senses, but there were basically two schools of religious thought. You were either Jewish and you honored Jehovah, though their traditional flawed approach to it, Jesus exposes, but so you either had that or you were a what? You were pagan, idolatrous, right? You had a multitude. So both were going to require some really radical rethinking in order for Jew or Gentile to be willing to come and embrace salvation in Jesus, just because of all of those facets. All right, jump into lesson 6, if you have it there. And I didn't apologize, I didn't pull up my Bible software yet, but we'll get it up. Maybe. And I want you to go to Romans chapter 12. That's where I want to obviously begin in this lesson. I have always felt that Romans 12, in these first couple of verses in particular, are some of the most significant thoughts for anyone who desires to be a follower of Jesus to have to appreciate. Paul writes to those in Rome, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so there's basically, there's lots of smaller thoughts here in some senses, but there are two larger thoughts. One, the first is we're going to have to be a living sacrifice. So we're going to have to make sacrifice in order to honor God. It's a requirement, for lack of a better description, but it's just necessary, if you will, in the process of drawing closer to God, that we present our bodies. Don't you think about that phrase? Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. I think that's important because when we think of the word sacrifice, generally what do we think of? Give up something, and generally we think of that as stuff. I'm going to sacrifice stuff. And that's really not exactly what he's saying. It may be part of this sacrifice, but it is a bigger picture than that here. When he says present your bodies as a living sacrifice, in other words, not just my stuff, but myself. Everything about me is now a sacrifice that is to be holy and acceptable unto God. And it's perfectly reasonable, acceptable for God to expect that from us. How does it manifest itself in verse 2? It's for the transformation. So this living sacrifice necessitates a willingness to not be conformed to the world, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds, that we may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The living sacrifice that Paul is challenging us to here is one that is a willingness to transform out of the world and into a mindset that is spiritual and acceptable before our Creator. Because the concept of sacrifice, in some senses, can change over time, right? If you read through the worksheets, what did he for 4, 5, 6 paragraphs there, what did he illustrate? Yeah, generational sacrifices are different, right? Ask a generation that went through World War II what sacrifice is. Ask a generation that had an old wooden structure out behind the house that you crawled through 3 feet of, so they tell me, 3 feet of snow, right? And ask them what sacrifice. You know what I mean? We generationally, our concept sometimes of sacrifice changes because sometimes we're only thinking about things as being sacrifices. God has a much bigger picture than that. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. And what's interesting about that aspect, Bob, is that we belong to God either way. But the difference is, am I willing to embrace that or rebel against it? And that really is the mindset we have to decide. Which am I? Am I a willing, living sacrifice, willing to go to the altar, or not? Because in theory, if you will, or in principle, we all belong to Him. We're all His creation. But what He wants is a creation that chooses to present themselves on the altar of service to Him. Our very being.
That living sacrifice, is that how we live our lives?
Well, yes. I think that really it's a contrasting thought, right? Because as Bob was pointing out, the Old Testament sacrifices ultimately what happened to them. They all died. Okay, but God isn't saying I want you to sacrifice in this context. He's not saying I want you to give up your physical life. He says I want you to live it as a sacrifice for God. I want you to take your life and live it as a daily, perpetual sacrifice before Jehovah. Not a dead one where it's a one-time moment, right? Once the lamb's been offered, it's offered. But for us, it's a perpetual, continual sacrifice.
In the Old Testament, when they sacrificed, it was giving the best of what they had. It was a physical sacrifice.
Yeah.
Should have hurt. You had to give the best
Yeah.
that you just raised, and it was killed, and that was that.
Yeah.
Now it's you. You have to give yourself.
Yeah. And the truth is, it's easier to give stuff than it is to give self, and that's the truth. What's just think. Let's think about it from a simplistic manner. What's easier to give? 2 hours of your time, or $10 out of your wallet? Right? If you were given the option, you can give me 2 hours of volunteerism, or you can throw $10 at me. Most of the time, we reach in our pockets, right? Because time means I have to give of self. I have to give myself. And so that's the changing thought process we have to get to. Because if our concept of sacrifice is solely about how much I've given, then again go back to the generational conversation. I mean, lives were given in times of war. Utter inconvenience and was given, in terms of just daily comforts and things that we use. I mean, I really think at times we if it didn't harm anybody's safety, we need the whole grid to go down. Everything just go down. And it would force people to have to start what? Communicating and talking and being connected again. Now keep in mind, I say that while I use a wireless tablet on the pulpit with a cell phone in my pocket, projector over my head, right? But we can become so accustomed to conveniences that if they went away, we would say, I'm making a what? A sacrifice. And the truth is, not really, right? Not really. Okay? There's a difference between being inconvenienced and making sacrifice. Giving up my cell phone would be highly inconvenient, not a sacrifice. Giving up my computer this morning would be inconvenient, but not a sacrifice. And that's where we got to start flipping our thinking a little bit. Because if we're always thinking about any time I'm inconvenienced, I've made a sacrifice, then wow, what a low bar that would be, right? If everything we thought was a little bit inconvenient for us was what is qualified as a sacrifice, then that's a pretty low standard. And that's a pretty easy standard then, unfortunately, to go what? Go, good job, Brian. You preached this morning and you didn't even use technology. Boy, what a sacrifice you made on behalf of it. Right? But that's sometimes the way we think. Sacrifice is bigger than that. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, and again, and that's going to happen, right? Every generation is going to have something new to them, technologically speaking, that makes, in their minds at least, life easier and more convenient. But again, a reminder that you wouldn't have to go very far back in time to realize that you're not really dealing with things you've sacrificed or not sacrificed. It's just a matter of where, and we are out of touch with the difference between those two things. What's an inconvenience and what's a sacrifice? Because God wants us to be a living, daily, continual, perpetual, soul-giving sacrifice to Him. He wants me. And when He gets me, then everything about me follows, right? Then stuff is really easy to take care of when it comes time to give up things, because I've already given up self. And really, to me, in some ways, the only thing that creates some significance in relationship to the things is if I find myself resistant to giving up things, then I probably haven't given up self. And that's really the only indicator benefit, if you will, of that kind of conversation, is if I would be unwilling to be inconvenienced to give up some things, then I'm probably struggling with giving up self as well. No, because the only sacrifice that really provided that was the blood of Jesus. And what I would say is that the offering of our lives, our living sacrifice to Him, is a result of His literal blood sacrifice, not in conjunction to, but as a result of. If that makes sense, because He gave His life literally out as kind of the final sacrifice of that type. By the way, He's the final blood sacrifice necessary to bring redemption to man. It's a reasonable expectation of God, that's the words here in the text, for Him to expect me to give up my daily, continual life dedication to Him because of what He's provided in salvation in Jesus. So connected, but yet not directly, if that makes sense. Yeah. Any other thoughts about that? And again, he shared a whole lot of examples with that. At the very end of that, and I guess I could go back to that for just a moment, but at the very end of that, he talked about the idea they understood literal sacrifice. Even the idolatrous folks would have understood. In fact, he makes an interesting point. in the worksheets, he said, really, the types of sacrifices that both Jew and Gentile were offering looked what? They look similar. They're using the same kinds of animals. They have altars and temples they've built in order to provide, make these sacrifices. If you were to lay them side by side, the only difference was the who it was that was and the God that they were sacrificing to. But if you were to just look at them, they all had, and so a concept of sacrificing things was understood by Jew and Gentile alike. They needed to come to terms with the idea that they must also sacrifice self in order to honor God. And because, top of the second page, because of this approach that many of them had adopted, they in many senses Jews had created a view of God, pagan world had created a view of their gods as these inflexible, distant, demanding creators without a lot of kindness, compassion, or love. They were just these beings that they believed existed that were just unreachable in some senses, and not really all that concerned about the well-being of the worshipers, but were just kind of these beings that were making these lists of demands. And I think that could be illustrated as being true because any time, and you go back into pagan gods as well, but any time a problem occurred, they would say the gods must be what? Angry. We've upset the gods, and therefore this series of calamities has occurred because we've angered the gods. And that was so Paul says, when you get up every day and offer yourself as a living sacrifice, you're making a connection to your Creator. You're building a bond and a relationship that is beyond just this, He demands of me certain things. And there's a greater sense of connection, if you will, between ourselves and Jehovah. Yeah. Every little aspect of that, though it may seem small in the moment, all of those small things like that create a greater connection and a greater appreciation of the living sacrifice that I am before God. And so from Romans chapter 1 through chapters 11, just prior to what we read in chapter 12, Paul deals with all these basic concepts that many of them would have been strange to most converts or folks that he was striving to educate and teach concerning God, because no longer was it just the person who fulfills the demands of the gods. It's the person who recognizes that God provides salvation to those who will place their confidence and their trust in the good news of the gospel. In other words, their concept prior to the gospel message, in many senses, for both Jew and Gentile alike, was righteousness required me to fulfill a certain list of demands that a God was placing upon me. I'm going to have to earn righteousness. The gospel says righteousness is something that is a result of what? Of faith and trust. Righteousness isn't about being perfectly good because I can't be. Righteousness is something that God bestows upon us as we faithfully and dedicatedly trust Him. They didn't trust their gods. They were completely afraid of their gods, and so continually offered sacrifice in order to hope that the gods wouldn't get angry and cause a flood or cause an earthquake or cause a building to collapse or cause some other calamity. That was their view of God and or gods. And the gospel's got to reprogram people's thinking as it relates to that. No longer is it about you trying to appease just to be sure nothing bad happens. Now it's a concept of I actually trust this God. I actually rely upon my God. I actually have faith and confidence in Him that He does have my best interest. They're pagan gods in particular. Their mindset was they have their own selfish interest in mind and the things that they may or may not do to me as a result of my act. So it's a radical change of thinking about how it was that you would be in relationship, if you will, or connect to your gods. Righteousness no longer based on how good I am, but righteousness based on how willing I am to trust and serve and sacrifice myself to the God of heaven. Thoughts up to that point before we begin a process of covering 11 chapters of the book of Romans in 8 minutes this morning and 45 Wednesday night. So obviously we won't hit everything, and we'll kind of take his abridged approach here where he just kind of encapsulates each chapter for us in this the workbook. But I do want you to run. I think it's important that we at least kind of get the setting, if you will, of what Paul was dealing with. So go to Romans chapter 1. And I want to start in verse 18 because it's interesting. If you didn't read far enough into the book of Romans, Paul almost is describing what we just talked about, right? God's an angry God, God of wrath, God of one who's going to bring consequence and retribution. If you didn't read all of what Paul says about it, you would maybe get the false impression. But what Paul's doing is he's building an understanding in order to get them to a place that needs them to be. You've got to kind of read, in some senses, the whole letter to get the picture of what he's doing. So, is the wrath of God real? Yes. It comes against the ungodly and the unrighteous. There in verse 18. And here's a key: who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them. Paul, by the way, to me is he's the perfect choice to have a conversation about this. Because that was him. Remember what Jesus says to him on the road to Damascus. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Paul, you know better. You know better. It's exactly what he tells this audience as well. You know better. Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. You know these things. For God has showed it to you. For the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Would you know how to be saved without the Bible? That's not a trick question. No. You can't know how to be saved without the Bible. Can you know God without the Bible? Yes. Those are two different things, right? The very nature of the world around us screams a creator. It doesn't just nudge us, it screams creator at every turn and at every point. The way our bodies are designed, from the details of how our eyes work to every aspect of the creation around us, it is continually bombarding our minds with the reality that this world was created. There are two too many variables for all of these things to have perfectly come together to create the world that we live in and the things that are in it. It exudes Creator. The Bible tells us the who, and the Bible tells us what we should do about that knowledge. But Paul says to them, you know basic understanding of the world that we're in, and you know God, and you're without excuse, because the very nature of the world around us should be explaining those things. Because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God. Though you knew it, you refused to honor Him as God. Neither were you thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Quick point that he's trying to make is simply this. If you abandon your knowledge of God, what's the result? Yeah. So if I don't want to honor God, then I'll change the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man. Why do you have all these pagan idols all over the place? Well, it's because you rejected the very knowledge of a single Creator that's all around you. And you chose to worship the four-footed beasts and the creeping things and all those things. And as a result, God says what? Verse 24. I'm going to let you what? I'm going to let you do that. I'm not forcing anybody to honor me. I'm not, jump to chapter 12 where we started this process, I'm not forcing anybody to be a living sacrifice. You got to make that choice. God says, I'm not forcing you to do it. And I'll even let you become so corrupt and vile that you dishonor and destroy yourselves in the process. God is willing for you and I and the world as a whole to make whatever choices and decisions that we want. Not without consequence. That's Paul's point as well. But God's not going to forcibly make anyone be a living sacrifice. Their image of God and gods, plural, were that those gods were forcibly making them do all kinds of things. Paul says, God of heaven hasn't made you do anything. He allowed you to make choices, even if they were vile, even if they went against the very nature that we were created in. He said, I'm going to let you make those choices. And all of that wickedness there that he speaks of in verse 29, the unrighteousness, the fornication, the wickedness, the covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispers, all that stuff. God says it's all corruption and it's all vile and it's all in opposition to me, but He's not going to force anybody to avoid